Hi there, everyone. So I am here today to do our podcast recording for this week's, last week's social justice counter narratives text. So we looked at Karen Walker's A Subtlety, which had a lovely additional title, The Marvelous Sugar Baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant. So that gives us a great deal of information about the context and the importance and the meaning of this particular artwork. However, as we discussed and worked together over this week to sort of understand and grapple with what we also found that we brought to the table when we looked at this piece, I think we can agree we had a fascinating discussion. So I'm here by myself. So I am very happy to be returning to the role of the teacher. So my lived experience of being in this course is an interesting one, because I wouldn't be surprised if some of you might have scratched your head and wondered why I'm doing this course, as you've seen me in the teaching videos, but then you've also seen me on the board as a student. And we didn't really explain what was going on there or why. I didn't think it was actually important. And I apologize for being a chronic late submitter and erratic commenter on the boards. But I was going to co-teach this class because Julia has done such an amazing job of expanding the original curriculum that we put together to teach this really important subject. But my life got really busy and I knew I wouldn't really be able to commit to the role that the important role of teaching in this course. So at the last minute, I said, well, I'll just be a student. And the reason that I did that was because I needed the work, the creativity, the reflection, the present moment awareness that's what we sell as the benefits of doing this kind of work. It's something I'm really committed to doing. So thank you everyone for having me back in as a student in this. And Julia's new texts that she's chosen are spectacular. I have refrained from looking ahead to find out what we're doing each week, because I can do that. My privilege of having access to the back end of the learning. But it's been really, really wonderful to see how things have unfolded in incredibly meaningful ways. So let's get into this text. So, my disclaimer here is that because this is just me having a discussion, hopefully not too circularly with myself, but you can't not be biased by the things that I bring to the table, because that's how, that they're my life experiences. They're the ways that I form my identity and my narrative about who I am in the world. So this is going to be under the lens of that. But all that considered, let's get into things. So the first thing I wanted to recognize about this text was that what the text itself is, we're actually studying a video of the sculpture, not the sculpture itself. So in that video, we are offered so many different perspectives about the importance, the process of creating the artwork, what this particular work means as an artwork within sort of the frame of the social commentary that it's aiming to portray. So we have multiple mediums that add more knowledge, kind of, thicken our understanding of what these things mean. There's music in there, which Helen and Lorraine discussed on the board. We see the charcoal sketches and the sugar maquettes that sort of show the process. How did the artists get to here? We see the workers using their various techniques and their mediums to make this really imposing sugar sphinx. So we're not experiencing the primary source. We're not going into the derelict factory with the molasses oozing down the walls. We're not witnessing the vastness, as Anne Pasternak says, of the sugar factory doing a large part of the work, which is creating a space for those uncomfortable and difficult conversations that come up when we challenge some preconceived ideas, or some ideas of what is an accepted truth, perhaps, which, you know, in this instance is the role of slaves in the global sugar industry, and the role of women, and slavery in general. So this week we're talking about counter narratives. So I thought we'd just take maybe a little bit of a nerdy academic wander into some definitions, so that you can get, you know, a bit more of a sense of what we have examined as we've close read and explored this week. So for a definition, you know, counter narratives, they're the stories that people tell and offer the stories which people tell and live, which offer resistance, either implicitly or explicitly, to dominant cultural narratives. So it follows that if you're going to be in resistance to something, then you have to have that master narrative to contend with. So these master narratives, or meta narratives, or grand narratives, they're all the same thing. Really what they're doing are these ideas that become kind of sequences of action, routines that develop these normal experiences, the way we expect the world to be, and that they become ingrained, you know, that they become things that we stop questioning. They make us identify with a normative experience, and that, you know, becomes internalized. So really that is their big power, is that we don't even sometimes recognize those big narratives that we live out as we're going through day-to-day life, because we stop questioning them. They've become so normal to us. And as I was thinking about these master narratives, I thought one person that popped into my mind was Julian's mother from our text a few weeks ago. And we can remember the discussion that we had about her experiences and her maybe master narratives around the story of her family, and how it was related to, you know, wealth of a plantation and slave ownership. So she actually gives us a really good way of seeing sometimes, you know, how out of touch and even alienating these narratives can be when times change, when things move on. Because what we have, you know, Kara Walker here, the artist, you know, what she's really bringing to the fore with this artwork is helping us to understand that, you know, the sugar trade, the slave trade, you know, traded sugar for bodies and bodies for sugar, right? So, you know, Susan made a really, really good point about this, is that the way that the artist sort of, you know, sugar coats, I think it's polystyrene or, you know, some other structural material, you know, is kind of a, you know, a sugar coating around the horrors of the people that were involved in this trade and the things that they encountered. So I think it's really meaningful, in fact, that, you know, that this is this we can see in this image, or in this sculpture, the physical features that are most definitely of a Black woman, or a normative Black woman, as we might discuss later on, but that we see her as white. We see her because she has this sugar coating. So there's many layers that we discussed around the way that the medium of sugar and the whiteness of the sugar influenced what we came to think and feel, and the kinds of reactions that we had to this particular piece. So I think the naming of the piece, the subtlety, it's a very interesting naming, and the artist sort of chuckles herself about how could she not create a sugar sculpture when she makes reference to the historical story of how these sugar sculptures were used as a show of wealth. So that's hardly subtle in itself. Of I've got a sugar sculpture and we're going to eat it, and that shows how wealthy I am. It's kind of a false modesty in a way. But also, the scale and the impact of this piece is anything but subtle. So I think with the name, it's like Walker's already calling into question that, the unheard story here, or these sort of this white sugar coated truth, perhaps, of the role of slaves. I think she's almost recognizing it's not such a subtle story, that she's not perhaps revealing something that is well hidden, but actually just making it so obvious that we have to talk about it. That like the Anne Pasternak says, like, of having those uncomfortable conversations about what this really means, right? And interestingly, Fiona mentioned here the most interesting part of the sculpture was the color, that this sphinx-like image, which is clearly recognizable as a black image of a woman, the lips and the face and the roundness of the body and some of the clothing features show us that this what is being represented, where that is recognizable, and that she is literally carrying the sugar on her back. There's whether it's the fact that her sort of more her sexual organs, her breasts, her vulva are very obviously portrayed, which might be provocative or it might be a submissive body posture, but it's morphed into this representation of the Sphinx. So continuing what Fiona was talking about here is that this Sphinx is made of bleached white sugar. Sugar doesn't start off white. It doesn't come out of the sugar cane white. It starts as molasses. And molasses, if you've ever seen it, is black, and it is sweet, but it's got a whole other sort of earthy kind of taste that's very, very different to the kind of the clean, sweet taste of white table sugar. So the idea of the whiteness might also be a commentary around the way that we value, white mannerisms, white appearances, that part of the experiences that perhaps these slaves or the or Black people in general have of this attempt to whitewash them, like the sugar, to hold up a different set of values that might give them more meaning or social credence, which maybe a purity of sorts. And that whiteness of the sculpture is just so sharply contrasted to the blackness of the factory that I think it's such a striking image. It makes me wish I'd been able to go and see it and to feel it and experience it, but we only have the video that we can see. So if we think about that idea maybe of the portrayal of a black woman in this white sugar, we can also think about the other ways that this sort of normative image of a black woman is portrayed. So Catherine made a really great comment here about this image seems to fit into a cheerful, maternal, grandmotherly kind of image that would have looked after the children of white families, perhaps, but is so at odds with the actual experiences of these women, of being alienated from their own families, and perhaps living in fear of people, of a person that has ultimate power over them, and certainly of the aspect of being sexually taken advantage of. Kim keeps going with this idea of recognizing the top knot, the headscarf, and the way that it might show the difference between a person with white skin that is in a serving kind of a role versus a person that has black skin, and that even though there's sort of a servitude involved, that it's still very different depending on the color of one's skin. The last thing I wanted to talk about in the sort of the form and the figure of the image was the position of the fingers. And this wasn't something that I necessarily saw myself, although I really enjoyed the discussion that you had about it. And so, I think everyone did a little bit of research. We collaborated on trying to understand what this fig position of the fingers actually means. So Susan wonders if this is a fertility sign or an expletive gesture. And a couple of you found that out, that there were lots of different meanings. Fiona says in Portugal it means good luck. In Turkey it means not very nice things. About what about you, just go away quickly. Deepak says that maybe this is a solitary sign of resilience, or even rebellion, shown by this black woman in an otherwise pathetic, submissive countenance. So when I saw this discussion, it made me think like this was like a hidden bonus level in a computer game. Like Walker seems to put this here for the audience to interpret based on their own perspectives. And so she's giving you the opportunity there also to create some of your own story for this sculpture. I think that fits really nicely into recognizing perhaps the individuality of this person, that even when we're thinking even about the idea of a counter narrative, that a counter narrative in conflict, or in conflict with a master story, perhaps, we all bring different individual perspectives to the ways that we might contend with or counter those kinds of narratives. So that might be a nod to that with the fig symbol. But one thing that Walker is much more expressive in doing is showing us what she really thinks with the use of space and scale of this image, this sculpture, to tell this resistance story. The size of the sculpture makes it impossible for the figure herself, but the story that she tells, to be invisible. So I think that's really a contrast to the way that multitudes of Black slaves that have worked in that factory might have been seen as being homogenous, or being non-differentiated, of being just this mass group of people. This sculpture itself is absolutely singular and imposing. So Lorraine talks about this. So she says, you know, Walker is one of the last to create something in that space. Walker herself, as a woman of color, is building a monumental and ambitious project of heroic proportions in a hard environment, and makes a really, really good observation around the way that the project represents perhaps Walker's own history of life in America through her ancestors working in hard environments, suffering abuse of all proportions, lacking the space to be valued as humans, as people. So when we, you know, I think this is a really clever point, and again, this is Lorraine's work, is, you know, that the crew members describe the factory as a hard environment, that it's less than hospitable. And you know, perhaps alluding to how much this resembles the conditions of slavery. It's not a comfortable place to be, and it's not a comfortable subject. So, you know, that the observation there is that seems fairly ironic and myopic, because no one is considering, you know, a slave situation or a you know, early days perhaps of American society where Black people were brought from Africa to fulfill these needs, and then brought, you know, as cattle. No one's thinking of those conditions as being, you know, less than hospitable. So I think, you know, I'm sure inadvertently the text itself, the way that we are getting other people's thoughts and opinions about their experiences relative to this piece, shows us another kind of story that fits around this particular text. So I think I really wanted to examine, you know, as a, you know, a narrative feature, is the way that time works in this piece. And I think that time works here in the way that the value of sugar has changed over time. So Helen makes a great point here. You know, she, you know, talks about how much, you know, sugar goes into making this piece that, you know, is going to be thrown away. You know, I think, you know, 25 tons of this once incredibly precious resource, you know, goes into making something that is going to just be, you know, thrown away at the end. That the factory owners themselves are willing to, you know, just, you know, donate that amount of sugar, and that what had been so hard won, perhaps, by that required the slave trade, that required you know, a kind of, you know, global sourcing of people and products, you know, is now able to just be, you know, thrown around and given away and used in sculptures, and that it's not even really in this context considered as a source of calories that could feed people that, you know, that are missing out on food. And we'll come back to how that story is relevant also. But this sense of time, this change in the value of the commodity itself, is interesting. And again, this is Helen in response to Daniel, talking about trying to find a balance in this particular piece of not ruminating on the past, that, you know, things have changed, things have moved on. We don't have people in that particular context working in that way, but that also that it shouldn't be forgotten, that this, you know, this factory is going to be demolished, but the sculpture even if that's also demolished, is something that can be, you know, recorded and re-examined over time, to make sure that we, you know, we keep a sense of the importance of that particular story. So where did I go after that? So that's, you know, so, you know, historical progression, this change and the sense of the time. I'm going to come back to the Sphinx. You know, it's because the Sphinx, you know, is a nod to the ruins. So again, there's a component of time there, and that time has passed, time has changed, but, you know, this, they also talk about, you know, there's sort of a temple-like feeling in the sort of the dilapidated old factory. But I think the Sphinx also talks about, you know, mythologizing Black women's bodies. So we've got a really interesting and powerful kind of a motif here. And that, you know, obviously the Sphinx, while it has, you know, it has some history in Greek mythology, perhaps we're most familiar with it in Egyptian history, and the Sphinx in Giza. So Catherine brings our attention to the creative curator, Nato Thompson, his name is, and so in the film, Thompson talks about you know, the role of the idea of the subtlety, and that there's an edge and a knife in the work which doesn't hit everyone. Some people will just take this sculpture at its face value, perhaps of a big-breasted Sphinx woman in a factory in New York, as its own kind of a novelty, I suppose. And then he goes on to compare the Sugar Sphinx to the Egyptian pyramids. And I started to, you know, I got irked a bit by him when he's talking about the importance that, like, if you were to visit the pyramids, that you really should, he was sort of putting, you know, the idea out there that you really should recognize and understand that that the pyramids were also built by slaves, and that just looking at the awe of the size and the cleverness of the design, you know, was maybe not enough to really recognize what it took to make that particular now, you know, wonder of the world. So why I was irked by this, by this curator, was that I didn't like him telling me or others how I should experience this work. So, you know, that kind of like he's imposing this narrative upon the pyramids, right? So, I mean, it even made me, you know, get kind of, I like the fact I was contending with it, because I was really thinking, you know, what's the grand narrative? What's the counter narrative here? You know, particularly like thinking about the Egyptian pyramids, because you know, it's not a resistance story told by, you know, the slaves themselves or by descendants of the slaves or anyone that was involved. But what he was saying was, if you just go and look at the pyramids and look at them in magnificent awe, you've somehow, you know, missed out on something. And like, I just think, you know, you're not giving people a chance when you tell them how to look at something. You're not giving them a chance to show up in the way that their master narratives and the stories they tell themselves about their life are. You're not giving them just the chance to be, but you're saying, you know, you have to get the subtlety that's here, because not everyone will and not everyone needs to. And even being able to, you know, as let's say if I go to the to see an artwork like this, part of the experience for me is to see perhaps how other people also witness this, and maybe they don't get the subtlety, and maybe they, you know, take photos with their hands on boobs or something like that, that, you know, is as probably as interesting and as insightful as the artwork itself. So NATO, yeah, got my back up a little bit with that. But what it reminded me of, and I'll put this into our community notice board, was of some really interesting work done by a sociologist called Ali Hochschild. I think that's her name. So she wrote a book a couple of years ago, pre-Trump, but very relevant to that, in that she talked about some of the, you know, sort of the right side of American politics, and particularly in the South, and really sought to unpack what might look like some really irrational thoughts and bizarre decision making in those areas. And, you know, she moved there and lived in these sort of this society to try to understand what are the stories that these people tell themselves about their history and their identity through time and now. So I really enjoyed reading that, and I think it's relevant to this piece, because unless we give people a chance, I think, to exercise the way that their stories are for them. Again, I think back to Julian's mother, that, you know, we are kind of doing as much of a oppression maybe as we're trying not to do. Anyhow, let me get to the end of things. What I think from that, you know, moving on from the idea of time and the way time has been shown in this piece, in the way that sugar has changed in its values, I think what we see from that is the way then that we have a new narrative that emerges, and sort of and new social roles. You know, if part of the role of this particular work is to dismantle an old narrative, you can't have a vacuum. Something also has to come into that. You know, the evolution and the change of the way we understand things. And I think it's really interesting to look at perhaps how other forms of slavery perhaps still exist in which sugar plays a role. So, you know, Walker, again, she talked about the historical importance of sugar, that, you know, at one time eating sugar was ingesting the power of the king. So sugar had a motif of power. You know, and maybe the narrative that's running there is related to sugar as, you know, wealth and success of white people in the new world. So this, you know, this is, you know, European migration and discovering the world and all of those things. But now the social context of sugar is very different. You know, sugar is very much linked to poverty, to overconsumption. It's cheap. It's, you know, it's stuffed into fast food and cheap products that most often will probably be consumed by people who find themselves in lower socioeconomic groups, accompanied by the fatigue of working multiple jobs, the worry of financial insecurity, and even, you know, living in neighborhoods and areas where it's much harder to buy less processed and refined products. So this role of sugar has changed immensely. Deepak hints at that, even in the in reference to this particular sculpture. The significance of the medium is also to draw attention to the link between sugar consumption and type 2 diabetes. The Black woman is clearly showing signs of metabolic syndrome, including obesity. So the role of sugar there, rather, you know, that and you know, obesity in history was often seen as a status symbol. So even that has been swapped and changed around to, you know, our status symbols now are buying, you know, organic fruit and vegetables at Whole Foods and having what maybe might have been a poor person's physique in earlier times. So Daniel responded actually to a post to my thoughts on this comment, and it reminded him of some family friends. He told a story about their socioeconomic status and that of their children who ate poorly. They were able to test him for diabetes regularly, but either weren't able to, or didn't know how to, or just didn't make any changes to his nutritional intake. They kept getting tested for diabetes. For so many different reasons, when he did get, I think remembering the story, he did develop diabetes, but there was a powerlessness to change. So perhaps there's still a story around sugar as part of power. It obviously has a very strong psychoneurobiological effect. We are programmed and to seek out sweet food to be able to survive, but in a environment in which that particular food has become so easily accessible, now we've got a shift in where that power relative to sugar lies. So to bring this back to the clinic, I'm going to use Lorraine's observations or discussion. We're thinking about our grand narratives and counter narratives in pain care, and I think this is really beautiful. And she asked, do our patients submit to us? Do they feel powerless and inferior? And I think most of us personally would think, well, we really try not to. We really try to seek that intersubjective space in which we are making decisions together and considering the whole story. But Lorraine says that she has certainly heard of patients who have experienced the kind of treatment in which patients have been told to know their place, and that in that they have felt neither seen nor heard. So absolutely, this idea of who holds the power in our clinical work is important. I've often thought about some of the ways that we talk about, explaining pain. What is pain? And the greatest value, I think, of pain education is about helping someone to create their own meaning that allows them to do new things with pain. But we're very often using metaphors and different narratives to try to tell the story about what that pain is. And is it a perception, or is it a sensation, or is it a prediction? Looking at lots of the different areas of science and investigation that might try to inform the things that we tell people. But what have we internalized as the truth that we might be imposing onto other people about what pain is, that doesn't really hold a space for them? And how can we consider possible the multiple truths, and that there's many interpretations of how that science fits into somebody's life, that it's really important that we consider our possible role in trying to put onto them a understanding that may not ever fit or might not fit at the moment. So I'm going to finish with what is the last standard question for the podcasts, which is, what is a discovery and where is this taking you? And you'll notice I haven't talked about our creative writing for this week. I stuck to our text, But where is this taking me is that I found the writing prompt really interesting. And I found that, you know, my reaction to the prompt of retelling something that made me feel powerless, I was fascinated when I sort of, you know, when I finished, because, you know, the having an imposed time limit will do all sorts of fabulous things to the way that you interpret what you're being asked to do. So what I did was I reframed my whole professional story of being a physiotherapist in a way that when I read it myself later, I had to question my own thinking about the story I'd told myself. I had to contend with that self story that I'd implotted about power and powerlessness in my life. And actually to be able to see that I have a great deal of power, where I had previously been framing it into powerlessness and perhaps lost life opportunities. And that power is both for myself and for helping others. So the question and, you know, the place that this is taking me is, what else can I do with this power? So that's all for my wrap up. Apologies, please, and thank you for the many ums and ahs. It is a little bit late at night in my side of the world, but I wanted to make sure I got this out in a reasonable time frame. And also so that I can get to this week's work, in which we're talking about self-care, which is incredibly important for us as clinicians involved in the work of caring for others. So thank you again very much for your attention, and I'd love to hear comments or any other discussion that we have, either about this or about other topics. So thanks very much, guys. See you.